So, it was just another quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the sun barely breaks through the trees and the world still feels half asleep. I'm standing there, coffee in hand, looking out the window at my yard, just about to enjoy the peacefulness of the day. But then, my eyes go wide, and my heart stops for a second. There it is, all over my lawn, leaves, and I mean a mountain of leaves. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I rubbed my eyes and blinked a couple of times, but nope, the leaves weren't going anywhere. And it wasn't just a few scattered ones, like I could ignore it. No, it was as if someone dumped an entire forest in my yard overnight. I immediately grabbed my phone, thinking it had to be some sort of sick joke, but nothing. No notifications, no messages. It was just me and my very questionable new landscaping. But the real question hit me almost immediately. Who the hell did this? I stood there for a minute, trying to process the situation. Was it the wind? Had I missed the memo about some weird local leaf festival? I decided to investigate, walking out the front door with that sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing someone was definitely responsible for this. But the real twist? It wasn't just leaves scattered across my lawn. It was a perfectly planned pile. As I circled around my yard, I started noticing signs, little hints that could point to who did this. And, just when I thought I had figured it out, I saw it. A familiar-looking neighbor's fence in the corner. Could it be them? What if I was wrong? What if I didn't have all the facts? The suspense was killing me. And the worst part? The mystery wasn't over yet. There was something about this entire thing that felt too personal. Just as I was about to grab my phone to make a call, I heard the sound of footsteps behind. The moment I spotted that familiar fence, I knew I had to find out exactly who had done this. I mean, this wasn't just a random mishap. No way. This was too strategic, too intentional. My gut told me this wasn't the work of Mother Nature. I had no choice now but to investigate, because whatever happened next, I was going to make sure I knew exactly who was behind it. The morning sunlight flickered through the trees as I stepped forward, my mind racing through all sorts of possibilities. Could it have been someone from down the street, or even across the way? I took a deep breath and started walking slowly, eyeing the pile of leaves with suspicion. There was something about it that felt deliberate, like they had been carefully placed, each leaf in a strategic spot. It didn't make sense to me. A gust of wind? Sure, maybe it could scatter a few leaves across the lawn, but not this. This was organized chaos, and that meant only one thing. Someone did this on purpose, and I was going to find out who. I looked around, scanning the area for anything suspicious. My eyes landed on a small garden hose next to the pile, half hidden beneath some of the fallen leaves. That was odd. A garden hose had no business being near the yard at this hour. As I crouched down to inspect it, I noticed something even more strange. There were footprints. The prints weren't just random. They were fresh, like someone had just walked through the area. My heart started to race. This was getting weird. Whoever did this was not being subtle. I followed the prints, hoping they'd lead me to the culprit, but the trail was broken and I had to guess which way to go next. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. I had a sinking feeling in my gut that this wasn't going to be easy. Still, I couldn't back down now. I knew something wasn't right here, and I wasn't just going to let it slide. It was time to step up my game. I spent the next couple of hours pacing around the yard, examining every inch of the ground. I wasn't about to let some mystery neighbor get away with something like this. I noticed a few more clues as I walked around. A leaf blower, tucked behind a bush near my side fence. Could they have used that to dump the leaves here? But what was the real motive behind it? I couldn't help but feel like this was more than just a prank. It felt personal. The more I examined the area, the clearer it became. Whoever did this had left a trail on purpose. It wasn't a mistake. The investigation was heating up. My next move was simple. I had to check the security cameras. I had a small camera on the side of my house, mostly to keep an eye on the back gate, but today, I was hoping it would give me the answers I needed. I rushed inside, fired up my computer, and pulled up the footage. At first, the screen was just a blur of trees and the quiet suburban street. I fast-forwarded, looking for anything that could be a sign of movement. After a few minutes of nothing, I almost gave up. But just as I was about to close the footage, I noticed something strange. There, just before dawn, Right around the time I'd seen the pile of leaves outside, I saw a figure, a person, wearing a hoodie, standing near my yard. I leaned in closer, trying to make out who it was. The person was too far for me to identify at first, but something about their posture felt familiar. The way they moved, almost like they were too comfortable in my yard. As the figure approached, they began to drop leaves in a deliberate fashion. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Whoever it was, they were standing there, calmly dumping leaves onto my property like it was the most normal thing in the world. My blood was boiling. This person was the one responsible for my morning disaster. But what was their motivation? Why would someone go out of their way to mess with me like this? I watched the video again, pausing at the exact moment when the figure turned to leave. That's when I saw it, a familiar garden gnome on the edge of my lawn. It was the one I had gotten as a joke for my front yard, but it had a distinctive marking. This was the key to unlocking the mystery. That stupid gnome had been a gift from my neighbor across the street, Timothy. As soon as I saw that gnome, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Timothy was the one who had done this, but why? What had I done to deserve this strange attack? And was this just some petty prank, or was there something deeper going on? I felt the heat of anger rising in my chest, but also a strange sense of satisfaction. I had caught them. I knew who it was now. But what I didn't know was why. Was this just a prank gone wrong, or was it something more personal? I couldn't let it slide. I needed answers. I started to plan my next move. I had to confront Timothy, but I couldn't do it recklessly. I needed to make sure I was fully prepared before I approached him. As I walked back outside, my mind raced with thoughts of the confrontation. I knew I had to be careful. This could go south quickly. The situation was more delicate than I had imagined. What if I was wrong? What if Timothy had an innocent explanation? Or worse, what if he denied everything and tried to turn it back on me? The last thing I wanted was to escalate things with a neighbor, especially over something as petty as leaves. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let it slide. Not now. Not after everything I had uncovered. It was time to get some answers, whether Timothy liked it or not. But before I could act, something unexpected happened. Now that I knew who the culprit was, Timothy, my so-called friendly neighbor, the time had come for me to stand up for myself. I didn't want to cause trouble. I just wanted to make sure he understood. At first, I couldn't believe how petty this whole thing had gotten. I mean, the guy dumped leaves on my lawn in the middle of the night like it was his own personal dumping ground. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how far I'd let it go. This wasn't just about the leaves anymore. This was about respect. This was about making sure boundaries were respected. I had already made up my mind. I needed to make my feelings known. But now, I had to be thoughtful. I wasn't about to act impulsively and risk making things worse. No, I needed to approach this carefully. I needed to make sure that whatever I did, it would be clear but peaceful. It had to be something small enough that no one else would care, but noticeable enough that he'd understand the message. That's when it hit me. The leaf blower. Remember that leaf blower I found hidden behind the bush? It had been such an obvious clue. It was almost too perfect. I realized that I could use that very same blower to return the leaves back into Timothy's yard. And not just any time. Oh no, I wasn't going to let him sleep easy. I was going to start early, at 6 a.m., when he'd be asleep and unaware. It would be like a gust of wind carrying all his leaves straight back into his yard, but with a twist. I wasn't just going to blow them back, I was going to be neat about it. I would show him how it felt to have someone disturb his space in a harmless way. I could already imagine his face when he woke up and saw the scene, wondering what had happened. But this wasn't some random event. It was a simple reminder. I knew this plan wasn't going to win me any neighborhood awards, but at this point, I didn't care. Timothy had crossed a line, and now it was time to set some boundaries. The clock was ticking, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt ready. This was going to be simple, yet effective. The thought of him waking up to a little surprise in his front yard made me smile. But as I sat there planning my next move, a strange feeling started creeping in. Was I really the kind of person who would go to such lengths for something so small? Was this really worth it? The whole idea felt petty. No, it felt childish. But something inside me kept pushing forward. Maybe it was my pride, or maybe it was just the principle of the thing. But I knew I had to do it in a way that stayed fair. I spent the next day gathering everything I would need. I dusted off the old leaf blower in my garage, and made sure it was working perfectly. I didn't want any issues when it came time to carry out the plan. It had to be simple, with no mistakes. I made sure it was fully charged, and I even bought some ear protection. I wasn't about to end up with ringing ears after I finished blowing those leaves. The next part of the plan was crucial: timing. The earlier, the better. I figured 6 a.m. would be the sweet spot, early enough to catch him off guard, but not so early that the entire neighborhood would wake up and start asking questions. I didn't want to attract attention, at least not yet. The day of the plan came quicker than I expected. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., my heart racing as I checked the clock. It was time to set things in motion. I couldn't believe how excited I was about this, but the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself after everything that had happened was almost too much to handle. I grabbed the leaf blower and moved quietly toward the backyard. I had to be careful though. Timothy's house was just a few feet away from mine, and if he heard the blower, it would be game over. So I kept my movements as quiet as possible. The leaf blower roared to life as I pointed it directly at the pile of leaves. For a second, it felt like the most satisfying thing I'd ever done. I could see the leaves swirling around in the wind, just like I had imagined. But it wasn't just about the leaves. No, it was about the message. This wasn't just about getting back at him. It was about showing him that messing with me would never be tolerated. As the pile of leaves shifted and shifted, I began to notice something unexpected. Timothy's front yard had a lot of leaves. It wasn't just a few stray ones that he had blown over. It was a whole garden of mess. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much effort he'd put into it. This wasn't some mistake. This wasn't just a random act of carelessness. This was intentional, and that made my job a whole lot easier. I spent the next few minutes carefully placing the leaves in the exact spots where I wanted them. I wasn't about to make this a quick hit. No, I had to make it as perfect as possible. I made sure to blow the leaves over the exact spots in his yard where they'd cause the most chaos, where they'd be the most noticeable. I even made sure the leaves piled up in a way that would make them impossible to ignore. As I stood there looking at my work, I couldn't help but laugh. This was going to be great. But just as I was about to call it a day, I heard something. A door opening. My heart skipped a beat. Was Timothy awake already? Had I been caught? I quickly ducked behind a bush, trying to stay out of sight. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear footsteps. This was it. I was caught. But then, to my surprise, I heard something that made me freeze. It wasn't Timothy. It was his dog. Apparently, the dog had gotten up early and decided to do its morning routine, totally unaware of the situation. I breathed a sigh of relief. That was too close for comfort. I took one last look at the scene and snuck back into my house, trying to hold in my excitement. The deed was done. But would it work? Would Timothy get the message, or would this backfire in a way I wasn't prepared for? One thing was certain. This was just the beginning. The morning finally arrived, and with it came the weight of the decision I had made. The plan was set, the leaf blower was ready, and the time was nearly upon me. It felt almost surreal, standing in my backyard, knowing that in just a few minutes, I would begin my petty revenge. But I had to admit, I was excited. This wasn't some childish prank anymore. It had become a mission. Timothy had crossed a line, and now it was time to make him pay in the most satisfying way possible. The thought of waking him up with a leaf tsunami in his yard made me grin. I was about to give him a taste of his own medicine, and I couldn't wait. The clock ticked closer to 6 a.m., and I could feel the anticipation building. I had done everything I could to prepare. The leaf blower was fueled. The windows were shut to avoid making any noise, and I made sure there were no distractions. I wasn't about to mess this up. As I stood by the door, I checked the time once more. 5:59 a.m. My heart raced. This was it. I took a deep breath, opened the door as quietly as I could, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the neighborhood still mostly silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I took my first step onto the lawn and could feel the cold morning dew on the grass beneath my feet. It was oddly refreshing, almost like the calm before the storm. I walked around the side of my house, trying to be as quiet as possible, knowing that one wrong sound would ruin everything. As I made my way to the backyard, I couldn't help but smile. It was 6 a.m. on the dot, and I was about to unleash my leaf fury on Timothy. I grabbed the leaf blower and took one last moment to mentally prepare. There was no turning back now. I positioned myself just at the edge of his yard, making sure I was in the perfect spot for maximum impact. The last thing I wanted was to blow the leaves in the wrong direction or miss the sweet spot that would make it look like a carefully orchestrated act of vengeance. With a steady hand, I pulled the trigger on the leaf blower, and it roared to life. The wind picked up almost immediately, swirling around the pile of leaves I had so carefully prepared earlier. It was a glorious sight. The leaves were everywhere, flying in every direction, caught in the powerful gusts. I could see them moving toward Timothy's front yard, just as I had planned. The more I blew, the more it felt like the perfect storm. Each puff of air sent the leaves crashing into his pristine lawn, and I could already imagine the chaos it would cause when he stepped outside to survey the damage. The leaves didn't just settle neatly either. They swirled around, some clinging to the bushes, others piling up in the most inconvenient places, making sure he couldn't just sweep them away without putting in serious effort. I was laughing at the sheer absurdity of it all. It felt almost liberating, knowing that I was taking control of the situation in my own way. For too long, I had let Timothy walk all over me, but now I was shaping the narrative. This was my moment to shine, my revenge in full glory. But just as I was getting comfortable with the noise of the blower and the sight of the leaves flying everywhere, I heard something. It was a soft noise at first, barely audible over the hum of the leaf blower. I thought maybe it was the wind picking up, or perhaps a bird had flown by. But then it came again, a door creaking open. I froze. Timothy? Had he woken up already? No way. He had to be asleep. I had timed this perfectly. But as the door creaked louder, I realized it wasn't just any door. It was the door to his front porch. My heart raced, and I immediately stopped blowing. I had to be careful. If he saw me now, all of this would be for nothing. I quickly ducked behind a bush, trying to stay as still as possible. The last thing I needed was to be caught in the act, blowing leaves into his yard at the crack of dawn. My thoughts raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. I couldn't let my nerves get the best of me now. I peeked around the edge of the bush, praying that Timothy wouldn't come out any further. I could hear footsteps on his porch, but they weren't coming toward the yard. They were heading in the opposite direction, toward his garage. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It looked like he wasn't coming out to check the yard just yet. I took another deep breath and slowly resumed blowing the leaves. I had to make sure everything was perfect. This was my chance to deliver the final blow, and I wasn't going to waste it. The blower roared again, and the leaves continued to pile up. I had a moment of satisfaction, but then something else caught my attention. A figure in the window. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was Timothy, standing at the window, staring out into his yard. He couldn't see me, but I could see him, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. He must have heard the blower and decided to investigate, but instead of opening the door and coming outside, he just stood there, looking out at the leaves swirling in the air. Was he just waking up? Had he finally realized what was going on? Was he about to come out and confront me? The suspense was unbearable, and for a moment, I thought I'd been caught. But then, the figure disappeared from the window. I waited for a second, and then another. He didn't come outside. In fact, it seemed like he had just gone back inside, maybe even closing the blinds in a hurry. My stomach dropped. What was going on in his mind? Was he too stunned to react? Or had he realized that I was the one behind this? I couldn't tell, but I wasn't about to let up now. The deed was done, and it felt so satisfying to watch the leaves take over his yard. I continued blowing for another few minutes, ensuring every corner of his lawn was covered. I couldn't wait to see what he would say when he stepped outside. Would he be furious, confused, or would he just laugh and shake his head, knowing that he had crossed a line and was now paying the price? I had no idea, but one thing was certain. The next time Timothy thought about dumping leaves on my yard, he'd think twice. As I finished up and turned off the leaf blower, I stood back and surveyed my work. His yard looked like a war zone, a leaf battlefield. There were leaves piled high in the front yard, scattered across the driveway, and stuck in the bushes. It was perfect. The thought of him stepping outside and seeing it all made me smile. I had done it. I had won. But the real question was, how long would it take him to realize it? Would he go running to the HOA, or would he come over and confront me? Only time would tell, but as I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had just given Timothy a lesson he would never forget. The morning after my leaf-filled revenge, the sense of satisfaction was still fresh. I couldn't help but smile as I sipped my coffee, imagining the moment when Timothy would step outside and be confronted with the mess I'd left behind. It wasn't just about the leaves anymore. It was about sending a message. The act had been small, petty even, but it was a statement. And now, all I had to do was sit back and wait for the reaction. I had expected some immediate backlash, maybe a confrontation at my door or a furious phone call. But when I looked out my window at his house, I noticed something different, something that told me this wasn't just a regular HOA-style complaint that would go nowhere. Timothy's car was gone, and there were no signs of him being home at all. This piqued my curiosity, so I grabbed my jacket and decided to take a little walk around the neighborhood. I wanted to see the fallout for myself. As I walked past his house, I took in the view. His front yard still looked like a battleground. Leaves were scattered everywhere, and it didn't look like anyone had come out to clean it up. But the silence was unsettling. Where was Timothy? I couldn't help but feel a little unease creeping in. Had he gone too far with whatever plan he was hatching? Or maybe he was too embarrassed to face the aftermath of his own poor decisions. I kept walking, hoping to get some more clues, and soon enough, I saw Timothy's wife, Karen, standing in the driveway. Her face was a picture of confusion and frustration. She was on the phone, pacing back and forth, gesturing at the yard as if it had suddenly become some kind of disaster zone. It was oddly satisfying to watch her trying to figure out what happened, knowing that I was the cause of her frustration. But the real kicker came when I saw Timothy pull up in his car. He stepped out, and I couldn't help but notice the look of shock on his face as he surveyed the yard. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but then he just froze. For a moment, he stood there, taking in the chaos. There was a sense of disbelief in his expression. He couldn't quite wrap his head around what had happened. It was obvious that he had no idea what hit him. Karen rushed over to him, pointing at the leaves and speaking in rapid, agitated tones. Timothy shook his head, and I could tell he was trying to make sense of everything. I stayed hidden behind a tree, observing the scene unfold. I felt a mix of satisfaction and pride. He had finally learned what it meant to cross the line. There was no immediate retaliation, no angry confrontation, just confusion and a sense of embarrassment. And honestly, I think that was even better than anything I could have hoped for. Watching him struggle to comprehend the absurdity of the situation made it all feel worth it. But just as I was about to leave, I heard Timothy shout, "Who did this?" The question hung in the air, loud and desperate, but no one answered. I knew then that it didn't matter whether they figured it out or not. My message had already been delivered. The shame was already on his doorstep, and there was no escaping it. As I walked back home, a feeling of vindication settled over me. I had done what I set out to do. The balance had shifted, and it felt good. But what really made the story so sweet was the fact that I had taken control in a situation where I felt powerless. The little leaf blower moment had turned into a major statement that Timothy would not soon forget. Now, as I sit here, reflecting on everything, it's not about the leaves anymore. It's about standing up for myself and taking action when I felt like I had been pushed too far. Timothy probably thought that dumping those leaves on my yard would go unnoticed, but I knew better. And I think he learned that lesson the hard way. You might be wondering, what happened after that? Well, Timothy and Karen never came to confront me directly. In fact, the following week, I saw them out there, cleaning up the leaves on their own without any complaints. Lesson learned, I guess. The neighborhood's dynamic had shifted just a little bit that day. And while it was petty and small, it was also necessary. Sometimes people need to realize that their actions have consequences, no matter how small. And sometimes a little revenge is exactly what's needed to teach them that. Now, looking back, I can't help but laugh. Sure, it was a silly thing to do, but isn't that what makes life interesting? Sometimes it's the little moments, the ones that seem like they don't matter, that make the biggest impact. I'm not suggesting you go out there and start leaf blower wars with your neighbors, but hey, if someone's been pushing your buttons for too long, maybe it's time to take a page from this book and do something unexpected. You never know what kind of message you'll send, or how much satisfaction you'll get out of it. And hey, If you enjoyed hearing this story and want to hear more crazy neighborhood antics or dive into more stories of petty revenge, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss out on what's coming next. I've got a ton more stories lined up that will keep you laughing, shocked, and sometimes even thinking twice about what your neighbors might be up to. Thanks for sticking with me until the end, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.